I'm Jacob Kaplan-Moss. I'm one of the lead developers of Django, and I'm going to preach to you about documentation. Although actually, not so much. Of the questions I'm going to try to answer in this talk, the one that I'm going to skip is the why is documentation important? I frankly don't feel the need to justify that particular argument. So if you're here to hear me tell you why you should write documentation and why good projects ought to be documented well, you will be sorely disappointed. They should. I'm not going to explain to you why the sky is blue or why gravity works. They are there. I don't particularly need to justify them to anyone. Of the things I'm most proud of in developing Django, the one that really makes me really proud and really happy is our amazing documentation, and more than that, the documentation practices that we've inspired. I'm watching right now, just for one example, a bunch of these hosted Python services, Django Zoom, EPIO, Gondor, starting to get up and running. Most of these services aren't even out of private beta yet, and they already have really good documentation. If you compare this with similar offerings in other languages, documentation for these features are added these tools are added as an afterthought. We're even this idea that a good project means good documentation that Django has always espoused is starting to bleed over into other aspects of our community, and that makes me just absolutely incredibly happy. If there's one aspect of Django that I hope can endure, that I hope can last past Django's relevance, past Python's relevance even, I would hope it would be this idea of a documentation culture. A development culture where we understand that good code and good documentation go hand in hand and make each other better. Documentation isn't something that just sort of is something you have to do in order to make your project, useful. It's actually something that makes your tools better, that makes everything about your open source project that much better. I am talking mainly about open source here, but as I've just mentioned with these hosting services, these same concepts apply to internal code and internal work. And in fact, I would imagine that most private code is a lot worse than most open source code. So how do we get from here to there? What do we do to ensure that good documentation happens? Well, I want to try to answer 4 questions over the course of this talk that I hope will help you write better documentation, more documentation, great documentation. I want to talk about, first, why people go to documentation, what your users are looking for in their docs. So you can have an idea of who your users are, what the goals are for good documentation. I want to talk about who should be responsible for the actual writing of the documentation. Whose role is it? Whose job is it? I want to talk about what specifically should we document? Where should we be spending our documentation efforts? Where should we be spending our time? And finally, I'll talk a little bit about some tools that I think help make this process a little bit better or help make the end result that much cooler. So why do people read documentation? Why do you look for a project's documentation? What sorts of things why do you read documentation? What do you need? Overviews? Examples? You want to know if the maintainer's a nutcase, right? So you have a problem you need to solve. It's broken, how do I fix it, right? What's weird about documentation is you serve many, many different disparate users. You have new users who are coming to your project for the first time. They want to know, they've heard cool things about this Django thing, and they want to see what it's like for themselves. These are people who have never seen your project before, don't really have any idea what's going on, and need to dive in and figure out what's going on. You have sort of ongoing education. This is new users, this is also existing users. I've been using SQL Alchemy for years, but I've never had to use this part of it. So how do I get this particular thing done? You have experienced users who have run into problems. This may even be people who have written the documentation themselves. I consult Django's documentation frequently when I'm running into problems because I'll have this memory of, oh, I left a note there about how this can sometimes fail, and I'll go look it up. So, sometimes documentation can be note to yourself. So already we're talking about this entire spectrum from complete newbies to really advanced, experienced users. If this is starting to sound hard, that's because it is. You have to deal with people who are angry at you. It's broken and they don't know why. And if your documentation doesn't help them figure out why it's broken, they're just going to get angrier and angrier and angrier. And by they, I mean me, but I presume other people feel the same way. You need to document information for fellow developers, for people who need to know know how to contribute, right? The simplest form of internal documentation are, contributor guides, how to contribute to Project X. Subversion did this incredibly well at the very beginning, laying out the sort of complete how people should contribute to Subversion. And since then, that's been sort of adopted by a bunch of new projects. Django has our how to contribute document. Brett just finished writing a brand spanking new, improved version for Python. So documentation is not just for users, it's also for contributors when you're dealing with open source code. This is true of company code as well. I'm always annoyed when I work with a new company that has all of these policies and procedures in place and doesn't have them explained anywhere. A how to contribute to company X document is incredibly useful when you're a new developer trying to navigate sort of the personal politics of how work gets done at a new company. And finally, most users are coming to documentation over and over and over again for reference. This is stuff that they may have done a dozen times, but just you can't be bothered to memorize it. Stir F-time formatting. Has anyone memorized stir F-time formatting? I have to look it up every single time, and I probably do it multiple times a day. By the way, stirftime.org. That's fantastic. And this is why I put it on the little RevSys bag insert that we put in the PyCon bags, because I need that thing. I need it every damn day. It just won't stick in my brain. The important note, I think, to understand is that documentation is communication. It's your primary contact between you and your users. If you're any sort of reasonably successful project, you have this very small core of developers, and around that you have sort of your core of interested and engaged users. But then there's an entire group of people who are nearly invisible. They don't hang out on your mailing lists. They don't come on IRC. They may not know what IRC is. They don't hang out on Y Combinator and Reddit. They don't ask questions on Stack Overflow or whatever the fancy new thing is. You have a huge class of users for whom your only mode of communication with them, the only way you can talk to them, is through your documentation. And so good documentation needs to fulfill the same needs that good communication does. You need to have the same sorts of things in your documentation that you would have if you're talking to people in person or helping them on a mailing list or helping them on IRC. So the first point about what makes documentation great is when it's capable of serving multiple conflicting masters. This means you need to explain the same thing in multiple ways, right? If I'm looking for information about models in Django, I'm going to find 4 different ways of accessing that information, from tutorials to reference APIs and a bunch of things in between. You need to be able to pitch your communication to the people who are talking to you. So I've laid out an ambitious goal. That's a lot to do. I haven't told you need to document everything. I've told you need to document everything multiple times, right? So who does that work? Who should write documentation? Well, I mean, anyone, first of all. One of the big pitfalls of dealing with documentation is, an obsession with perfection. Perfection doesn't exist. You aren't being published, probably, so typos and grammar errors are okay. They'll get fixed over time. Typos in documentation are like typos in code. Many eyes make for shallow bugs. Your community will help you with your grammar. We get people who want to contribute to Django who don't speak English as a first language, and we have a requirement that when code gets committed to Django, it comes with associated documentation. And oftentimes, that can be a barrier to people who don't have excellent written English skills because they feel like they have to live up to the standards that already exist in the documentation. Missing that, we're looking at 4 or 5 years of refinement and honing here. Just because you need to have clear, good documentation, don't let that stand in the way of getting something done. It will get improved over time. It will get better. The important part is to sort of get the ball rolling and empower your community to help give you feedback and give you contribution. If documentation doesn't exist, people will just complain and go elsewhere. But if it exists and has some holes, some people will help you fill it. It's just like code in that sense. But just because anyone can write code doesn't mean doesn't mean anyone should write documentation. I see a couple of things happen to open source projects that just make me want to cry. The first one is when I see things like this. A great way for new people to get started is to write documentation. I'm sorry, but new users don't understand how your code works yet. They're exactly the wrong people to be writing documentation. You're going to be turning off new contributors by asking them to write your documentation for you, right? Oh, there's no tutorial. Why don't you write up your process of figuring it out, and that'll make our tutorial? No, you can't do that. It just doesn't work. The second one that really, really bugs me is if we just start a wiki, documentation will magically appear. Wikis might be an okay, thank you. And by the way, any ops code guys in the room? Great. Chef does this, and it drives me crazy every single time. It's not that wikis necessarily are the wrong tool for the job. It's not necessarily that there's something structurally wrong with wiki software that makes it impossible to use for documentation. But this idea that anyone can contribute doesn't translate to anyone does contribute. In practice, a wiki is where good documentation goes to die. You need something, if you're going to have a wiki, you need to use it as if you would use any other tool. Yeah. The only people who can write really good documentation are the developers themselves. If you're a core developer of an open or closed source project, writing documentation is your responsibility. I know that sucks. Most of us are better at Python than we are at English. That's why we're here and not, at the MLA Association meeting. But the fact is that we're also the only people who really, really understand this stuff. There's really no substitute for information, communication provided by the person who wrote the feature. This is why Django requires that new patches come with new documentation, because the person who wrote that code is the person who understands it the best, and usually the person who can communicate it best to their audience. When you've just written some cool new feature and you're showing it off to your coworkers and you've got that excitement, yeah, and then you can do this, and look at how I was able to make that happen, and now we can, let our tool do this. Channel that excitement into prose. I want to give a quick shout out for Corey's talk next on documentation-driven development, because this is a great sort of workflow hack to make this process work. All that documentation-driven development means is, like test-driven development, writing your documentation before you write your code. But it can be a really good way of sort of getting the ball rolling on writing that docs. And rather than steal Corey's thunder, I'll just leave that and let him talk about it. Okay, so this is the real meat of what I want to talk about. What sorts of things should you document? What does good documentation contain? What's sort of the structural elements in your documentation? I really break it down into 4 areas. I wrote a blog post about this about a year ago. If you've read that, you'll recognize the first 3, but not the 4th one. A few people pointed out I was missing a really important part of this. Tutorials, topical guides, how-tos, reference material, and troubleshooting. Troubleshooting was the one that I forgot about and that a lot of people forget about as well. So tutorials are quick introductions to your project or maybe to an individual part of it. Kathy Sierra wrote on her sadly defunct blog that sort of the sign of a good piece of software is when a new user can experience Win within about 30 minutes. And that's always been my sort of guideline for a tutorial. It's about the focus that I think most developers have when they're trying out a new tool. They're willing to run with you for a bit, but within about the first half hour, they need to have a moment of like, yeah, this is pretty cool. Okay, I can do that. If you can't get someone from knowing nothing to a good positive experience within around this time, they're going to go elsewhere. They're going to go to a tool that can. Tutorials ought to be easy, right? The vast majority of your users ought to be able to get through them. They shouldn't leave people behind. But you have to be careful about not making them too easy. We make this mistake in Django a bit. We gloss over some problems that you'll run into later on. We sort of set up our tutorial to let users completely ignore Python path, which sooner or later is something you have to learn. And we need to do a better job of not setting up users for future failure. It's bad when you finish your tutorial and think you know what you're doing and then get bitten when you sort of try to scale up your ambitions. So the right balance between, you want to let anyone who ought to get through your tutorial do so, but you would also like to weed out people who simply aren't qualified. So you shouldn't, if your tool is intended for developers, you shouldn't try to write a tutorial that someone with no programming experience can go through. You'll set them up for failure when they realize the tutorial is all that they can do. And the best tutorials give you a sense for how the project feels. When I work through a tutorial, what I'm trying to figure out is whether I'm going to like this tool, whether it's going to fit my brain, whether it's going to feel right for me. And this is a matter of taste. It's not a matter of technique. So you should try to show off the sort of the je ne sais quoi, the essence of what your tool feels like in actual production. I can't really articulate this better than that, but you all know that sort of software has taste, and you want to give people an essence of what that taste is so that they can decide how happy they're going to be with minimal investment. Once a user's completed tutorials, they're going to want to actually build something of their own, and that's where topical guides come into place. You know, how to write a model, how to write a template, how to a guide to SQL Alchemy's data mapper, whatever these things happen to be. The point of these guides is that they should be conceptual. Tutorials are all about parroting. Type this code into the window, copy and paste this here, run this command. You're holding people's hands. Topical guides are where you kick them out of the nest and let them fly on their own. People should come away from these guides with an understanding of what's going on their own rights. You want to try to be as comprehensive as possible. In these, this is not the time to gloss over things. People are diving into the CSRF protection documentation because they need to understand every aspect of how it works. So give them that. You can link off to reference for details. You don't have to document every single API here, but you should be pretty full there. And most importantly, explain to me the why. Why would I use this? What is it good for? How does it work? One anti-pattern that I just have to complain about is some people have like introductory tutorials, and then for the real documentation, you have to go buy a book. Not only will I not buy the book, but I won't even use the project. That's just, if your code is open source, your documentation has to be also. That's just unacceptable to do it any other way. Once you know how a tool works, now you need to know the particulars of every single API, and that's where reference comes into place. References need to be completely complete. Every public API should have an existing piece of documentation. If it's not documented, you might as well not write it, because I won't know how to use it. Telling people to read the source is not an option, and auto-generated reference is worse than reading the source. The only reason I can see to use automated reference is if you need to generate a big stack of paper to fulfill some contractual requirement. There's absolutely no substitute for documentation written by people. Don't try to make software write English. It's not good at it. The final bit that you need to have is answers to questions that people ask when they're angry. And this is one of the places where Django falls down pretty hard, and a lot of other projects do as well. Our FAQ they are not questions that are frequently asked. They are questions that we didn't have anywhere else to put in the documentation, so we answered in the FAQ. People are going to get stuck, and you need to help them. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide in particular because it's kind of chart junk. But I encourage you to download my slides and look at this, because I first saw this in a talk given at OSCON, and it completely blew my mind. The idea is that each of these elements, tutorials, guides, reference, troubleshooting, it's fractal. It exists in every part of your documentation. So the whole project has this structure, but then when you dive down all the way to the level of a section, and in each individual section introduces a topic, gives a how-to, gives some examples, cross-references to related topics, and then has some, if this doesn't work, try, blah, blah, blah. This basic structure of these 4 elements, a high-level walkthrough, a conceptual overview, a complete reference, and then help, is recursive. It occurs on every element from the entire project as a whole down to the individual paragraph level. So I spent like an hour staring at this chart when I first saw it, and it clicked something for me, so I encourage you to do the same. So I will close by giving you a couple of tools to help you manage this process, but I really want to point out that tools, for the most part, don't particularly matter. Don't let your use of tool... We're all developers. It's really tempting to think that this new piece of technology will improve everything, will make everything possible. And it's especially tempting to say, well, none of the existing documentation tools do what I want, so I'm going to write my own. The most important thing is that you get writing. But I will point to some tools which I think are particularly nice. Sphinx is an automatic documentation generator that takes plain text, turns it into really nice HTML, also PDFs and other formats. It's rapidly becoming a de facto Python documentation tool, and for good reason, it ought to. If you're writing Sphinx and you need somewhere to put it, you should be putting it on Read the Docs. I'm on a mission to make Read the Docs become the de facto place to host Python documentation because it looks good, it has integrated search across all the documents there, so if you host your documentation there, I can find it. It's really nice. I'll also mention some of these tools. Doco, Pyco, Rocco, Shaco, yeah. These are all implementations of literate programming tools. Pyco is the one written in Python. And this basically takes comments and generates this sort of particular literate programming style guide. This is really good for example code, where you're walking through how to write code bit by bit. So, to remind you of where I was, what I've gone through here, everybody reads documentation, so you need to pitch it to everyone. The people who need to write the documentation are developers. There's no substitute for your project's developers writing the documentation. Remember this idea that really good documentation is fractal, and that you need to sort of maintain this structure of what to do, how to do it, complete reference, and then what to do if it goes wrong on every level of your project, from the largest to the smallest. And tools don't particularly matter, but we have some good ones, so you should use them. Thank you. A few minutes for questions, 5 minutes? We've got time for some questions if you want to come to the mic.
Do you have any recommendations for tools for end-user documentation who needs included screenshots, like click here, enter name there?
Tool suggestions for end-user stuff. Not. I mean, I tend to also use Sphinx, because you just can embed images. But another useful tool for that sort of task are screencasts. Screencasts tend to be really good for showing people UI. I don't have any particular suggestions, but there's about a zillion different tools that do them.
Good job.
Thank you.
About 30 years ago, I had to maintain a teletype printer, and it was broken. And I went to their documentation, and there was no section that really addressed the problem that I was having. But in the back of the manual, there was a section called Theory of Operations, which described what the engineers intended, what they had in mind, how they thought the pieces were supposed to fit together. And using that understanding, I was able to solve the problem on my own. And I thought, wow, this is the best piece of documentation I've ever seen. How do you see that being addressed by what you propose we do today?
I mean, that's a topic, right? That's an overview of the entire. I mean, this is what I mean by fractal, right? Because that's the topical guide for the entire project, right? You have a topical guide for, you know, the strf time function, but you also have a topical guide for for Python, and that's basically where I see that fitting in. One example of that type of documentation that I've seen recently that's incredibly well done is Pyramid has a series of what do they call them? Is it design justifications or design arguments? Does someone remember what they called them?
I think it's design defense or something.
Yeah, design defenses. That's what it is. Where it's basically like a critique and answer of why things are designed the way they are. It's incredibly well done, and a very, very, you're right, it can be really useful for people who are trying to like internalize the workings of the tool. I completely agree.
You mentioned that you don't like the idea of pointing new contributors to the documentation.
Yeah.
I tend to really like this, not for new documentation, but for improving the wording in the actual documentation.
Right, well, there's a difference between saying, oh, that feature isn't documented, why don't you go do it? And saying, oh, I'm sorry you had trouble with that area, why don't you suggest some ways of improving it? You know, what were you missing, right?
It's just so that the majority of patches that I get for my projects are actually documentation related. So
right.
really from typos to improved grammar and everything related. And I would really like to encourage people to do that because it's really, really helpful, especially if you're not a native English speaker, to get improvements to your documentation from first-time contributors.
Right, I mean, I completely agree, and we're the same way. We get a huge number of documentation patches. I don't think I was clear enough there that the pattern I'm arguing against is the why don't you, as your first contribution to this project, document some area of the code that we haven't documented yet? Because it's tempting to say documentation is annoying, so we'll make the new guy do it, you know, until he's sort of paid his dues. That's a terrible way to get contributors because you give them the worst jobs first, right? This will be the last question. Sorry.
This is not meant to sound snarky at all. I'm just using Django as an example. So bear with me. The widget class is completely undocumented in the Django documentation.
Entirely possible.
You can't, there's no way to know how to write your own widget class without reading the source. And the reason for that is that the developers felt that by documenting it, they would be committing to the API by documenting it, so that they would be committing to backwards compatibility for that class. I'm wondering if you think that's really the right decision versus just adding a disclaimer or something, because I think people are going to dive into the source and write their own widgets anyway.
Yeah, I mean that's one sort of specific thing that we've done badly is our standards are that every public API is documented. That shouldn't mean that every private API is undocumented. And unfortunately, we've done that. So, we need to be doing a better job of documenting our private interfaces and and at the same time making it clear. The issue is that once you document something, people tend to assume it's public, and no matter how many warnings you put all over it, people are still going to shoot themselves with it. So we have to figure out a way to, I agree, right? Like, I've written custom widgets, and it annoys the heck out of me that I have to go dive through the code, but at the same time, we do change that interface from release to release, and people will be really angry with us when we do. So that's a difficult, I see Brett nodding vigorously, so he has the same problem with Python. So why don't we take this discussion offline? Maybe you have some good suggestions about how we could do that. Thank you all very much.